Oh, I didn't have a ride to the retreat center, which is, way out in the Pennsylvania country. And I was at the airport, and I called Alex. He was the secretary of the organization, and Alex got me a car, and it was sort of a really nice, like a limo. So I got the full treatment as the speaker on poetry.
Welcome to Grief Heals, the podcast that explores how grief heals. Join us as we consider how grief invites love within ourselves, our communities, our world, our histories, and how it is that grief heals. I'm Lisa Michelle Zega here with Eric Simpson. I saw this meme and it talked about, I don't remember exactly what it talked about. What I remember was the visual of why love matters. And so it showed stick figures, but where they're fat, like they've got a body, and everyone was colored, like let's say tan. And one person representing love comes in and they're, let's say, red. I don't remember actually what color. You see the visual image of it spreading out, and then the two people next to the red become red. And then on it goes how we are in the world and how our energy is in the world. It matters. I mean, when I drive, Eric, I am sending love to my fellow travelers because I don't know what's going on in their life. I do know this. They need love. And I believe that love can be sent as an energy that is powerful from me to others. I don't want to drive angry. I mean, that's just one example of how this fleshes out in my life. The passage I was telling you about with Jim Forrest, I feel like where he was throwing darts at LBJ, I feel like that represents this.
You want to talk about that? I mean, you've been reading the book by Jim Forrest, who is a peacemaker and a public figure. Well, he's left his body behind in 2022, but he acted as a peacemaker in the Roman Catholic Church and in the Orthodox Church. You're reading his autobiography, his memoir that he wrote not long before he left his body behind and went on to do other things in a realm that will follow sometime in the
Mm.
future.
Well, you know what's really coming up for me, and I definitely want to share this story. I won't read it, I'll just tell it and
Okay.
hopefully do it justice. But it is from his book, Writing Straight with Crooked Lines. That, oh my goodness, I just love that title. One of the things as a peace worker, he tells a story that he used to have a poster of Lyndon B. Johnson, and he would occasionally, for amusement, throw darts at it. He had this dream, and in his dream, he and LBJ were on a bus. They were passengers on a bus sitting next to one another, and they started having a conversation. They did not agree. In his dream, LBJ was saying a lot of what he'd heard him say, on the news, at press conferences, etc. And then the president asked him to get off the bus and go for a walk with him. And they did. And they didn't talk, they just walked. And Jim just noticed their feet plodding along, kicking up fall leaves. When he woke up, got out of bed, and the first thing he saw was that poster. And it looked like it had been riddled. Oh my goodness, I'm getting choked up. It looked like it had been riddled with bullets. And he barely made it back to his bed, collapsing in tears with the weight of murder in his heart. And that utterly changed his approach. He was also giving peace talks and things of this nature, and he began doing it in a way wrestling with his own experience and inviting others in a compassionate experience for all. peace is the answer, right?
Hmm.
Not a war to peace. Peace itself is the answer. And so that even included in things like how we are holding those perpetrating great crimes, how we're holding them in our hearts.
Well, I know that one of his favorite things to talk about was a comic strip, which I have never seen, but it was called Pogo. And there's a little strip of Pogo saying, I've met the enemy, or it is us. I don't think that Jim Forrest ever met Ram Dass, but Ram Dass had a similar story about how he put a photograph of, I think it was Kissinger, in his icon corner in his altar so that he could pray for him because he had such animosity towards him for the same reasons, Vietnam and war crimes and things like that. I don't remember exactly how I came across his website, but I was looking into Dorothy Day, and Dorothy Day was influenced by a French guy who was into agrarian economies and wrote little short poems to try to get his message across. Right now, I can't remember the guy's name, but he had a political philosophy called distributism. And so I didn't know what that was. And I wrote to Jim Forrest to ask him what that was because I read about it on his website. And he said he didn't really know what it was, but he continued to talk to me about Dorothy Day. And we just started at that time an email dialogue back and forth. He lived in the Netherlands, he lived there for a long time. And over the course of time, I guess it was I'd written some things that he published in the journal that he put out called In Communion, a journal of the Orthodox Peace Fellowship. I think it was in 2009 that he asked me if I would edit the journal, and he would be the chief editor, but I would like put it together and things like that. So I did that for I don't know how long, a couple of years. And that at that point our friendship became more intense, and he would read everything that I wrote and give me comments pertaining to orthodoxy and the spiritual messages that we were putting forth, that he was putting forth. He encouraged me to write a book that I wrote on the Beatitudes, which is kind of funny because he had already written a book on the Beatitudes. I just wonder, he never said anything if he thought it was odd that I was basically writing the same book. But it was from my perspective and not his. And so my book's a lot different than his. His is probably better. He was more seasoned and a better writer at the time. Now I'm a perfect writer. He, so that's basic. That's basically how I got to know him.
Well, from reading his book, I am struck by the similarities of your relationship with Jim and his relationship with Dorothy Day. And that he was asked pretty early on in his work with the Catholic worker to do what Jim asked you
Hmm.
to do. That's also how they nurtured their relationship. And
Hmm.
then it's also striking to me that most of his relationship with, say, Thomas Merton was through correspondence, right?
Hmm.
And that I would imagine, just based on reading his memoir, that he saw you um, both as a peer and as just by your age and experience, right? As someone that he was getting to sow into what wisdom, what experience he himself had. And
Hmm.
even when you talked about writing the book and that he'd written the same book,
Hmm.
or not the same book, the same
Hmm.
topic, which and he knew that that would not be the same book. And what
Hmm.
strikes me, I mean, I've read your book, I've actually read it twice, and I'm grateful that he influenced you to write it.
Hmm.
And it's just like this this web of connection and
Right.
seeing it, like his life, this man that I never met has had this profound influence on me because he's had this profound influence on you. And it's just,
Well, it's interesting about his life is that if there's any luminary from the 20th century, he's probably encountered him or met him or her. He seems to have,
That's what's so, yes.
I mean, he talks about being a kid and meeting Ray Bradbury. I mean, it doesn't have to be someone like Thomas Merton. It's just all kinds of famous people that he's come
Right.
across and met.
And in these odd kind of ways, right? Like I think Bob Dylan is one that he had, and in fact, he had asked Bob Dylan to be one like a performer at one of
Mhm,
the rallies they were doing, and Dylan agreed.
mhm.
The organizer who Jim was working for couldn't stand his music and said he sounded like a herd of dying cats.
Yeah.
So Jim
That's probably his
literally had to,
voice, not his music.
well,
Yeah.
okay, fine. It couldn't stand his voice. That's a thank you for the clarification. And he didn't tell him why he needed to cancel. He just told him plans had changed, but they didn't have him come.
Yeah. Yeah. But I don't think he really knew Bob Dylan, but they did have that encounter. He did know Joan Baez, who was another folk singer, and I think had a relationship with Bob Dylan at one point.
Yeah, well, he just mentioned having contact because they traveled in the same
Right.
circles, and he
Right.
said it's not like they hung out, but he
Yeah.
definitely had a connection with them.
Right.
So, regardless, I just the number of people his life encountered that are familiar to many is kind of wild. So then what has him leaving his mortal body been like for you in terms of not having that correspondence or
Well, the correspondence had sort of slackened off in the last few years, and he corresponded with a lot of people. There's a lot of people who tell similar stories. He was influential in the lives of many people. So for me, I mean, we had sort of the correspondence had more or less come to an end. There might be, interactions here and there on Facebook, but I think he was getting sick and he was busy writing a lot. He wrote a new book on Dorothy Day, and then he wrote a book on Daniel Berrigan. I don't know how to pronounce his name. And he wrote a book on Thich Nhat Hanh, and he wrote a book on loving your enemies, and he wrote a book about himself, his autobiography. And he did all this within a very short time, just a few years. Sometimes I can get a little, especially back then, I've tried to be more circumspect because I'm aware of the impact that I have on other people and I want to have a positive impact. And that's something I learned from Jim Forrest. When he had words to say someone, he chose his words carefully. And I've read other people that testify to that. I mean, for me, the impact isn't as strong as I think somebody who knew him on a daily basis. I mean, I met him once in person. I was invited to give a lecture on poetry in Pennsylvania in 2009. He wasn't the one who invited me. It was the secretary of the Orthodox Peace Fellowship. And there was something happened. My flight was messed up, and I didn't have a ride to the retreat center, which is way out in the Pennsylvania country. And I was at the airport, and I called Alex. He was the secretary of the organization, and Alex got me a car, and it was sort of a really nice, like a limo. So I got the full treatment as the speaker on poetry at the conference, which had a lot of weighty topics. I actually ended up just reading a couple of my poems and didn't give a lecture like I knew something. But but I met him there, and he embraced me, and it had to have been a lie. But he said, "I came all the way here from the Netherlands just to meet you in person." So I've always remembered that because he was so kind and gentle and compassionate. And those are the things about him that have influenced me more than his doctrine or things that he believed. Because I had some points of disagreement with him, but that I never voiced because I didn't think it was important. There was a point in time when I wanted to publish an essay about the Metropolitan of the Orthodox Church in Russia, whom he had met before he became Orthodox. And it's my understanding that this person influenced him towards Orthodoxy when he was visiting Russia. And this person is now a I'm going to write an article about him because he had like a Rolex watch, and there was a little bit of scandal surrounding the guy, and he, was pushing for like moral laws based on morality, where women shouldn't wear certain clothes, and things like that, which disturbed me. And Jim did not want to publish an article like that in Communion, which makes sense to me. And now Carol is the guy's name, is like Putin's side guy in this war in the Ukraine. But I never heard any kind of judgment from Jim Forrest about anyone.
When he talked about peace is the answer,
Hmm.
peace is the way, peace is the answer. And love facilitates that, like that, and you see that in that story, and that's why I think the topic of grief heals, like that's my understanding, is that my understanding, my experience, that entering sorrow is entering the human experience.
Hmm.
Entering the human experience is like it evokes, it invites, it love. And that is one of the biggest things, like in my own career, where because I've worked in social services, and where I've made the biggest mistakes is my heart posture towards those in power. Look, war is never the answer. War against my fellow man, war against the ones in power, war against it's like that's not the path. And where I have made those people my enemy, and those people just for me, anyone that I deemed as in power and not recognizing the plight of our fellow man, and making challenges more difficult than they need to be. I also dehumanized
Hmm.
people in those positions, and that cannot and will not be the answer. And so entering
It's
the depths of our humanity, and maybe that's it, Eric. Grief, just I'll just say, for me, has been a portal into my humanity, which has been a portal into my connection to all living beings. Experience more love in my heart toward all people than I ever have. And I was such an angry, desperate
mhm.
person.
I think that it's easy to dehumanize people who don't act like human beings. But I think that what you're saying is it resonates because they are human beings.
Yeah,
And that's, we're called to love our enemies. And even if they're behaving as enemies to humanity,
yeah.
I'm reminded of the Japanese man. I wish I could remember his name, but he did movies like Spirited Away. I don't know if you've ever seen that.
Mm-mm.
And oh, you should see that. It's animation, but it's for adults and it's very well done. I think it's called Ghibli Studios. In his movies, there's always, there's an enemy. There's like a witch. There's often witches in the movies, and other kinds of people who, present a danger and present a problem. And they're just treated with understanding and compassion by the main characters. And the main characters are often like little boys or little girls. And it's weird because in the United States, if you see a cartoon like this, they usually get what they deserve. The bad guys, you know, maybe not for kids, they don't get killed. That's in the adult movies, which you know Jim Forrest called the Gospel according to John Wayne, where the bad guys, the robbers
Yeah,
who get killed or whatever. But in these movies, the people are basically converted and loved and become the friends of the characters. I mean, there might be a couple of exceptions, but I love those movies because of that. And it reminds me, it's in line with what we're talking about, I think. So if you've never seen Spirited Away or some of the other movies, I'd highly recommend them. They're really good.
well, I'm definitely going to watch Spirited Away. And then one of the things that in Jim's book right as you open the cover, there's like an ancient image. It might be from Greek Orthodoxy, I'm not sure, but it's like a crude image of Jesus on a cross. But it's just like etched, right?
Mhm.
Anyway, I'm reading this book, but every time I open it, I see that specific image. What has struck me reading this book, and I ended up writing it in big letters, is like grief is love. That this idea of Jesus is entering the suffering of mankind, allowing it in his own body as a, like, no, war is not the answer. I will take into myself your violence, your hatred. I will absorb it through love's power and I will rise again. This understanding that grief is love has utterly changed my view of substitutionary atonement. I, unlike you, am not well read in all the ancients and all the other atonement theories. That I don't have that in my wheelhouse. What I have is grief is love,
Mhm.
and it's transformed my view of the cross. And that was really scary to me. And then I learned, oh, the view of the cross that I was taught in evangelicalism is not the only view of why Jesus was crucified. And to me, just understanding that God loved the world so much that Jesus came to show us how to live in alignment with true human, which is loving. And then another passage that came to my mind when you were talking about Spirit Away is that you said little children are often the main characters.
Mhm.
And I was like, oh, to enter the kingdom of heaven, you must be like a little child. And the John Wayne theory is like, pay, you
Mhm.
evil, suffer.
The little child's like transparent, and
Yeah,
they innocently respect everyone they come across.
I was, pushing a stroller. I was big with child and had two children in the stroller. My eldest, who was 3 or just before 3, was in the front of the stroller. I was walking in Escondido, and there were just a lot of individuals living on this street, right? And this one man is walking toward us, and um, the smell the smell was coming toward us before he got close, and I averted my eyes, and my son said, "Mama, see that man?" And I said, "Yes." And he goes, "He's made in God's image." His words pierced me.
You've been listening to Grief Heals with Lisa Michelle Zega. The podcast is produced by me, Eric Simpson, in association with Jump Up and Down Productions. Music by Kendalian, Drunken Nights to Sunday Mornings, and Stefan Carlin, A Calming Ocean, A Common Notion. If you would like more information about the work Lisa does, point your browsers to legityou.com. That's LEGITYOU. Lisa can also be reached at lisamichelle@legityou.com. This has been a Jump Up and Down production.